Some of history's most effective defenses were never built at all. By the end of this video, you will see how rivers, forests, and simple earthworks stopped armies far more reliably than towering stone walls. Why did so many civilizations choose to shape the land instead of raising fortresses? And why has this clever strategy been largely forgotten in popular military history? We will travel from prehistoric earthworks to medieval border forests, across cultures and centuries, to uncover a hidden layer of military thinking. What does it say about human creativity when the best defense is the ground beneath your feet? A defensive landscape is any piece of ground designed to work against an invader without needing a single stone wall. This concept turns the usual image of defense on its head. Instead of building up, you work with what is already there. Rivers, mountains, swamps, and forests become natural barriers. But it does not stop there. Human hands can modify the terrain in subtle ways, flooding a low plain, cutting down sections of forest to create choke points, digging ditches that redirect water or block passage, raising mounds to break up formations. These are all examples of shaping the land to fight for you. The key is that these changes are often invisible at first glance. An army might march into what looks like open country, only to find itself channeled into a narrow killing ground or exhausted by miles of muddy, impassable ground. This approach is dynamic. It does not sit still. A river changes course with the seasons. A forest can be set alight or left to grow thicker. The landscape itself becomes a living weapon, one that requires little maintenance and no expensive garrison. Now compare that to a fortress. A fortress is a fixed point. It is expensive to build, costly to maintain, and vulnerable to siege. If the enemy simply bypasses it, the fortress becomes a prison for its own defenders. But a defensive landscape cannot be bypassed. It is the ground itself. Every step the invader takes is slowed, every supply line stretched, every unit forced to adapt. This strategy appears again and again across cultures, from the waterlogged fields of ancient China to the dense forests of northern Europe, from the wetlands of Southeast Asia to the vast plains shaped by earthworks in the Americas. The pattern is so widespread that it suggests a universal logic. When you cannot build a wall high enough, you make the world itself fight for you, and that is a defense that never crumbles. At its heart, this strategy turns time into a weapon. The invader who marches into a defensive landscape does not face one decisive battle. Instead, they face 1,000 small delays. Every muddy stretch of ground slows supply wagons. Every flooded field forces detours that add miles to the march. Every thicket of forest hides an ambush or a simple thorny barrier that must be cut through. Over days and weeks, these obstacles pile up. Soldiers grow exhausted. Food and water run low. Morale begins to crack. The army that started strong becomes a tired, hungry, and frustrated force, easy prey for a defender who knows the ground. This is the core principle of attrition. The defender does not need to destroy the enemy in a single clash. They only need to drain the invader's strength until the campaign becomes unsustainable. Meanwhile, the defender can move along hidden paths, strike at weak points, then vanish back into the landscape. Compare this to a fortress. A fortress invites a siege. The attacker can surround it, cut off supplies, and wait. Both sides are stuck in a long, costly standstill. A fortress can be starved out, undermined, or stormed. But a defensive landscape never surrenders. It does not have a single vulnerable point. It is everywhere and nowhere at once. Even if the invader pushes through one obstacle, the next one is already waiting. There is another advantage. Defensive landscapes are often much cheaper to maintain than fortresses. A stone wall requires skilled labor, constant repairs, and a garrison to man it. But a swamp or a forest needs no upkeep. earthworks once dug can last for generations with only minimal care. For societies with limited resources, this is a game changer. A small tribe or a rural kingdom cannot afford a ring of castles, but they can redirect a river, plant a thick hedge, or dig a line of pits. These actions require labor, yes, but not the specialized skills of a fortress builder. And the result is a defense that grows stronger over time as vegetation takes hold and water reshapes the land. This thinking is ancient. Long before the first stone wall rose, early peoples understood that the ground could fight for them. They learned to use natural features not as passive obstacles, but as active weapons. The logic is simple, powerful, and timeless. And it is exactly this logic that we see appearing in some of the earliest known defensive systems in human history. The pattern is so old that it predates writing itself. So where did it begin? The answers lie in the soil of prehistoric Europe, in the river valleys of China, and in the dense jungles of the Americas. Let us step back in time to explore those first experiments in shaping the land for war. The oldest known defensive landscapes were not built by kings or generals. They were dug by hand, often by entire communities working together, long before the first cities rose. In Neolithic Europe, settlements were surrounded by simple but effective barriers, ditches carved into the earth, palisades of sharpened logs, and earthen banks that stood as high as a person. These features did not aim to stop a large army. They were designed to slow down raiders, keep wild animals out, and make any attack costly and difficult. The ditches could be wide enough to force attackers to cross in narrow columns, where they could be picked off by defenders with spears or slings. The palisades created a wall that had to be climbed or broken, and the earth banks added height and stability. But here is the key insight: these works were not separate from the land. They followed the natural contours of hills, streams, and ridges. The goal was not to impose an artificial structure on the landscape, but to amplify what was already there. As societies grew more organized, this principle scaled up. Along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, and along the Nile in Egypt, the great waterways themselves became defensive tools. A river could be a natural moat, but it could also be redirected. Canals were dug to flood low-lying areas, turning farmland into impassable wetlands. An invader approaching a Sumerian city would find their path blocked not by a single wall, but by a network of channels, marshes, and irrigation ditches. The ground itself seemed to fight them. Crossing a river required boats or fords, but those fords could be easily guarded. And if the water was released from a reservoir at the right moment, a small flood could sweep away a camp or ruin supply lines. The Egyptians used the Nile's annual flood cycle to their advantage. An attack in the wrong season might find the entire delta turned into a shallow sea, with only narrow causeways connecting dry land. Those causeways were easy to defend. Across the world, the Chinese Zhou dynasty faced a different challenge. To their north lay the vast steppes, home to nomadic herders whose mobility made them difficult to pin down. The Zhou response was not a wall, at least not at first. Instead, they created a belt of defensive landscape. They left wide stretches of forest untouched along the northern frontier, and they maintained marshlands that could swallow horses and wagons. These natural obstacles slowed raiders, forcing them to follow predictable routes where they could be intercepted. Patrols along the forest edges and watchtowers at key crossings completed the system. It was a living barrier that required no stone and no labor to maintain beyond the preservation of the forest itself. The strategy worked for centuries before later dynasties turned to the more famous Great Wall. Far away in New Zealand, the Maori people developed another form of defensive landscape. Their pa, or fortified settlements, were built on hilltops, terraced into the slopes, and integrated with the surrounding terrain. The terraces themselves slowed attackers, forcing them to climb in stages while defenders rained down spears and stones from above. ditches and palisades added layers of protection. But the genius was in the placement. Hills were chosen for their natural defenses, with cliffs on one side and a steep approach on the other. The shape of the land was the foundation. A park could be abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere because the defender did not need a permanent fortress. They needed to know the ground. All these examples share a common thread. Before anyone built a stone wall, before sieges and castles became the norm, people understood that the earth itself could be a weapon. They shaped it, flooded it, forested it, and terraced it. And among all the natural features they used, rivers and wetlands were perhaps the most powerful and most common. They offered a barrier that could not be climbed, a space that could not be crossed without preparation, and a resource that could be turned against an enemy at any moment. So let us look more closely at how water became one of history's most reliable defenders. Rivers have always been more than simply water. They were boundaries, highways, and weapons all at once. Throughout history, countless civilizations discovered that a river could do the work of 1,000 soldiers without ever needing to eat or sleep. The Roman Empire understood this better than most. Along the Rhine and the Danube, Rome faced not a single enemy but a whole frontier of shifting tribes. Building a massive wall across hundreds of miles was impractical. Instead, the Romans used the rivers themselves as the backbone of their defense. The Rhine marked the edge of the empire in the west and the Danube in the east. Legions were stationed along the banks, controlling every crossing point. Bridges were heavily guarded. Fords were watched day and night. Small forts dotted the riverbanks, often at key bends where the current slowed enough for a crossing. The water was not just a line on a map. It was a physical barrier that required boats, bridges, or barges to cross. Any army trying to invade had to gather materials, build rafts, or find a ford, all while Roman scouts tracked their movements. The river slowed them down, exposed them, and made them vulnerable. The same logic applied to the Byzantine Empire, the eastern heir to Rome. Their frontier along the lower Danube was even more challenging. The Danube Delta, where the river fans out into a maze of channels and marshes before reaching the Black Sea, became a natural fortress. Byzantine ships patrolled the river, while watchtowers stood on the high ground. But the delta itself was a weapon. Invaders from the north, whether Avars or Slavs or Bulgars, had to navigate the shifting waterways. They could be ambushed in the narrow channels. Their supply boats could be cut off. The swampy ground swallowed wagons and horses. The delta was not just a barrier, it was a trap that the Byzantines knew how to use. Further west and centuries later, the rivers of medieval Europe served a similar purpose during the era of Viking raids. The Vikings were masters of the sea, but rivers were their highways inland. They could row up a river, strike a settlement, and retreat before a local army could gather. But defenders quickly learned to turn the rivers against them. Bridges were fortified, chains were stretched across the water to block ships, and at key points the land itself was made difficult. On the River Thames, for example, the Anglo-Saxons built fortified burhs or defended settlements at strategic crossings. These burhs controlled trade and military movement. If Vikings tried to sail up the Thames, they would encounter these strong points, and if they tried to land, they would find the marshes along the riverbanks turned into impassable mud. The key was control of the water not as a free highway but as a restricted channel. The same principle applied to fords. A ford might look like a shallow crossing, but if the defenders knew where it was, they could block it with stakes or dig pits just below the surface. They could station archers on the far bank. Crossing a river became a deadly gamble. One of the most dramatic examples of using water defensively came from northern Italy in the Po Valley. The Po River and its many tributaries crisscross a wide, fertile plain. During the Middle Ages, rival city-states and invading armies from across the Alps frequently clashed here. But the defenders had a powerful tool. They could flood the land. By opening sluice gates or breaching embankments, they could turn miles of farmland into shallow lakes. This did not require a huge wall, it just required knowledge of the water system. An advancing army would find its roads submerged, its supply trains bogged down, and its soldiers wading through cold, muddy water. The flooded fields also made it impossible to bring heavy siege equipment close to a city. The strategy was used multiple times, most famously by the city of Venice and by the Duchy of Milan. Each flood was a temporary weapon, but it could delay an invasion for weeks or even months. In every case, the defender understood that water was not a static obstacle. It was a dynamic force that could be controlled, redirected, and released at the right moment. Rivers and wetlands did not just block, they shaped the entire battlefield. They forced invaders to slow down, to concentrate at predictable points, and to expose themselves to attack, and they required no stone, no mortar, and no garrison. The same principle would extend to another natural barrier that covered vast landscapes, the forest. Dense woodlands could swallow an army, break up its formations, and hide defenders who knew every trail and glade. Where rivers were corridors and barriers, forests were walls of shadow and silence, and they, too, were shaped by human hands into tools of defense. Beyond the winding rivers, another kind of barrier awaited invaders, the deep, tangled forest. While water could slow an army with currents and floods, the forest could swallow it whole. Dense vegetation did more than block the path. It broke up formations, hid defenders, and created a world of shadows where the invader could never be sure what lay ahead. For centuries, the thick woodlands of Europe served as natural fortifications, often deliberately maintained as buffer zones between kingdoms. In England, the Forest of Dean was not just a royal hunting ground. It was a dense, uncleared woodland that made travel difficult and military movement nearly impossible. Invaders approaching from the west would find their path choked by ancient oaks, tangled undergrowth, and narrow tracks that could be easily ambushed. The same logic applied across the Channel, in the Black Forest of Germany. This vast expanse of pine and fir stretched across the southwestern corner of the region, its dense canopy blocking sunlight, and its floor a maze of roots and fallen logs. Armies marching through the Black Forest had to slow to a crawl. Supply wagons got stuck, cavalry could not maneuver, and local defenders who knew every hidden trail and clearing could strike and vanish like ghosts. The forest was a living wall that never needed repair, but perhaps the most dramatic example of jungle as a defensive landscape came from Southeast Asia during the Mongol invasions of Vietnam in the 13th century. The Mongols had conquered the largest land empire in history. They were masters of open field warfare with fast-moving cavalry and disciplined archers. But when they tried to invade D-1EA, 1IV-I-1EC7T, the area of modern northern Vietnam, they found themselves fighting a different kind of war. The landscape was a dense, humid jungle where the Mongols could not use their cavalry effectively. The trees were so thick that archers could not see their targets. The ground was muddy and uneven, turning every movement into a struggle. The Vietnamese defenders knew the jungle intimately. They built hidden traps, dug pits covered with leaves, and set ambushes along the few passable trails. They used the vegetation for cover, appearing from nowhere to strike and then melting back into the green shadows. Disease was another factor. The unfamiliar climate and the swarms of insects took a toll on invaders who were not adapted to the environment. The Mongol armies, which had swept across Asia and into Europe, eventually had to withdraw. The jungle had done more to defend Vietnam than any stone fortress could have. Forests and jungles worked in a way that walls could not. A wall shows you where it is. It presents a clear obstacle to be overcome, but a forest hides its dangers. The invader cannot see the trap until they step into it. They cannot know which path leads to safety and which leads to an ambush. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be a defender. Every shadow could hide a bowstring. The psychological effect was as powerful as the physical one. And cavalry, the hammer of so many ancient armies, was almost useless in dense woodland. Horses are large, noisy, and difficult to control in tight spaces. A horse cannot charge through a thicket of thorns or over a fallen log. The forest neutralized the most feared weapon of the steppe nomads and the medieval knights alike. But the forest was not the only natural feature that could turn invasion into a nightmare. Beyond the tree line, rising above the canopy, lay another kind of fortress, the mountain. Where forests slowed and confused, mountains blocked and isolated. The steep slopes, narrow passes, and thin air created a different set of challenges, and defenders learned to use them just as cleverly. Beyond the shadow of the forest, the ground itself rises into a different kind of barrier. Mountains do not just block a path. They fracture an army into isolated columns, each one vulnerable and slow. The narrow passes become funnels where hundreds of soldiers must squeeze into single file, exposed to rocks and arrows from above. The cold at high altitude saps strength, and the thin air makes every step a struggle. For a defender, a mountain pass is a natural bottleneck that needs only a small force to hold. For an invader, it is a nightmare of logistics and attrition. History is full of armies that learned this lesson the hard way. The Alps, that great wall across Europe, shielded the Italian peninsula for centuries. The Romans knew that the mountains were their first line of defense. They did not build a great wall across the Alps. Instead, they stationed small garrisons at key passes, built watchtowers on high ridges, and maintained roads that allowed them to move troops quickly to threatened points. The passes were narrow, often barely wide enough for a single wagon. Snow blocked them for half the year. Invaders who dared to cross paid a heavy price. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps is famous precisely because it was so exceptional. He brought elephants and thousands of soldiers over the passes, but he lost nearly half his army to the cold, the terrain, and the attacks from local tribes. Even then, he could not take Rome. The mountains had done their work. They had drained his strength and bought the Romans precious time. Far to the east, the Hindu Kush Mountains performed a similar role for the Indian subcontinent. These towering ranges, with passes at altitudes over 4,000 meters, created a natural barrier that few armies could overcome. The passes were narrow and treacherous, often blocked by snow except for a few months of the year. Even when an invader like Alexander the Great pushed through, the journey was so costly that his army's spirit was broken. The Hindu Kush did not just block the path. It exhausted the invader, stretched their supply lines to the breaking point, and left them vulnerable to counterattack once they emerged onto the plains of India. Between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, the Zagros Mountains formed another natural fortress. These rugged peaks were not a single wall but a maze of valleys and ridges. An army entering the Zagros had to navigate a labyrinth of narrow gorges where every bend could hide an ambush. The defenders, whether Assyrian or Persian or later Kurdish tribes, knew every goat track and hidden spring. They built small fortifications at strategic points, not great castles but watchtowers and fortified villages that controlled the passes. A garrison of a few hundred men could hold a pass for weeks against a much larger force. The mountains made it nearly impossible for a large army to maintain supply lines, and the harsh climate of summer heat and winter snow added another layer of difficulty. Half a world away, the Inca Empire mastered the art of mountain defense. Their territory stretched along the spine of the Andes, the longest mountain range on Earth. The Inca did not build massive fortresses on every peak. Instead, they built a network of trails that climbed up and down the steep slopes, connecting settlements and military outposts. These trails were designed with chokepoints, narrow bridges over deep gorges, and steep staircases carved into the rock. An invader could not use these trails without local knowledge. Even if they captured a section, they would find the next pass held by a small garrison or blocked by a collapsed bridge. The Inca also built storehouses along the routes, so their own troops could move quickly while invaders had to forage in the thin mountain air. The mountains themselves were the fortress, and the Inca were its guardians. All these examples show a pattern. Humans did not simply accept the barriers that nature provided. They enhanced them. They built watchtowers on the highest points. They carved steps into cliffs to control access. They stockpiled supplies at key passes and destroyed bridges when an enemy approached. The natural obstacle became a manufactured one, shaped by human hands to turn a difficult crossing into an impossible one. And this leads to the next layer of the story. Because while mountains and forests and rivers could be used as they were, the most clever defenders did not stop there. They added their own touches, digging ditches, raising earthworks, and planting obstacles that turned a natural barrier into a death trap. The line between the natural and the man-made began to blur, and the landscape became a crafted weapon. Felled trees with sharpened branches became one of history's most common and effective obstacles. An abatis was simple to create. Cut down a line of trees, trim the branches into points, and lay them with the sharp ends facing the enemy. The resulting tangle of wood and thorns was nearly impossible to march through. Roman legions used abatis to block forest paths and narrow valleys. Viking raiders felled trees across the approach to their camps, creating a barrier that forced attackers to slow down and hack their way forward, all while archers shot from behind the cover. Medieval armies deployed abatis extensively, especially when defending a position they had only recently occupied. The beauty of this tool was its speed. A few dozen men with axes could turn a grove into a defensive line in hours, and if the enemy breached one section, the defenders could simply fell more trees to rebuild. The abatis did not require skilled labor, only muscle and determination. Beyond the tangle of branches, ditches and earth banks served a similar purpose but on a larger scale. A ditch dug in front of an earthen rampart created a two-part obstacle. The attacker had to climb down into the ditch, then scramble up the steep bank, all while defenders hurled projectiles from above. Some of these linear earthworks stretched for miles, forming boundaries that entire kingdoms used as their first line of defense. Offa's Dyke, built in the late 8th century along the border between England and Wales, ran for about 150 miles. It consisted of a ditch on the Welsh side and a bank on the English side, making any eastward crossing a slow, exposed climb. The Danevirke, a complex of earthworks across the base of the Jutland Peninsula in what is now Denmark, served a similar role against Frankish and later German armies. These structures were not castles. They were continuous barriers of soil and timber that channeled movement and forced invaders to concentrate at narrow, well-defended gates. They were cheap to build compared to stone walls, required only local labor, and could be repaired by simply shoveling dirt back into place. Smaller obstacles added another layer of misery for the invader. Caltrops, for example, were simple iron spikes arranged so that one point always faced upward when they landed. Scattered on the ground, they could stop a cavalry charge in its tracks. A horse stepping on a caltrop would be lamed, throwing its rider and creating chaos in the ranks. Soldiers on foot would also find their boots pierced and their progress slowed. Pits dug in the ground and covered with light branches and grass served a similar function. A hidden pit could break a horse's leg or trap a soldier up to his waist, making him an easy target. These devices did not need to kill. They only needed to slow, to wound, and to force the enemy to move cautiously, inch by inch, while the defender watched and waited. The cumulative effect of these obstacles was a profound change in the rhythm of invasion. Armies that relied on speed and surprise found themselves stumbling and stopping. Cavalry lost its advantage. Supply wagons had to be unloaded and carried around barriers. Every 100 yards of advance now cost time and casualties. The decision to push through meant accepting a steady drain of strength with no guarantee of a decisive breakthrough, and the defender, knowing the ground, could always retreat to the next prepared line. This approach reached its most dramatic form in the technique of flooding. But before we turn to that, consider what these simple tools reveal. A stone fortress takes years to build, costs a fortune, and locks defenders into one location. A ditch and abatis, a scatter of caltrops, costs almost nothing and can be placed anywhere. They turn the entire landscape into a fortress, one that can be abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere. They give the defender flexibility and the invader a nightmare of endless small delays. And in the next stage of this story, that idea of controlling the ground with water would transform the battlefield into something even more treacherous. Flooding a field was faster than building any wall. The deliberate release of water turned farmland into an artificial lake that would swallow horses, wagons, and entire infantry columns. The defenders did not need to fight the enemy directly. They only needed to open a sluice gate or breach a dike, and the landscape itself became a drowning barrier. This tactic required deep knowledge of hydrology. Engineers studied the flow of rivers, the height of embankments, and the timing of seasonal rains. A flood that came too early could be drained before the enemy arrived. A flood that came too late might be useless. The goal was to create a shallow lake, just deep enough to be impassable to men and horses, but not so deep that boats could cross. Mud, not water, was the true weapon. The most famous example of this defensive flooding was the Dutch waterline. The Netherlands was a land of polders and dikes, a country that had spent centuries draining water to create dry ground. When invasion threatened, they reversed the process. A line of low-lying land stretching from the Zuiderzee to the Rhine could be deliberately flooded by opening sluices and breaking dikes. The water was released in stages, creating a shallow sheet perhaps a few feet deep. It was not deep enough to float a ship, but it turned the ground into a sucking, muddy morass. Cavalry could not charge, infantry could not march, supply wagons sank to their axles, artillery pieces were impossible to move. The water also covered roads and paths, making navigation treacherous for anyone who did not know the hidden causeways. Only the defenders knew those raised paths which remained just above the water. They could move troops and supplies along these secret routes, while the enemy wallowed in the mire. The Dutch waterline was used effectively during the Rampjaar, the disaster year of 1672, when French armies under Louis XIV invaded. The Dutch flooded the polders and the French advance ground to a halt. The water did not win the war by itself, but it bought precious time for the Dutch to negotiate and regroup. Centuries earlier, during the Song dynasty in China, engineers used a similar technique along the Yellow River and its canals. Defenders would breach the banks of an irrigation canal, sending water across the path of an advancing Mongol or Jurchen army. The flood could be timed to coincide with the harvest season, when the fields were dry and the enemy expected easy movement. Instead, they found themselves wading through cold, muddy water, their supply lines cut, their morale sinking. The Romans also understood the defensive power of wetlands. They did not always drain marshes, sometimes they left them wild. The Pontine marshes south of Rome were a vast, pestilential swamp that discouraged invaders from the south. The Romans deliberately did not drain these marshes completely because they served as a natural barrier. The unhealthy air, the thick mud, the swarms of insects all combined to make the journey a nightmare. An army that tried to march through the Pontine marshes would lose soldiers to sickness and have its supplies ruined by moisture. It was a slow, miserable path that only the most determined would attempt. Flooding as a tactic depended on precise calculations. The defender had to know the height of the water table, the capacity of the canal system, and the exact moment when the flood would be most effective. Too much water and the enemy might find a shallow lake navigable by boat. Too little and they could wade through. The timing was everything. Often the flooding was done just before the harvest, when the fields were full of crops that would be destroyed. This was not an accident. The flood ruined the enemy's hope of living off the land. They could not forage for food if the grain was underwater. They could not graze their horses if the grass was flooded. The land itself starved them, but flooding required a network of canals, sluices, and dikes that could be controlled from a few key points. The Dutch waterline was not a single lake but a system of low-lying areas connected by canals. The defenders could flood one section while keeping another dry, using the water as a variable barrier. They could even create temporary islands of dry ground to lure the enemy into a pocket, then flood the surrounding land to trap them. This was a chess game played with water and mud. The engineering behind these defenses was sophisticated and often secret. Maps showing the height of dikes and the location of hidden causeways were closely guarded. A local farmer might know a path that looked impassable but was actually firm ground beneath the water. The invader had no such knowledge. They had to guess, and guessing meant risk. One wrong step could lead a column into a hidden ditch or a soft patch that swallowed a horse whole. The psychological effect was as powerful as the physical one. The enemy could see the water rising. They knew it was deliberate. They knew the defender was watching from somewhere beyond the flooded plain, waiting for them to give up or starve. Flooding turned the entire landscape into a weapon that required no ammunition, no soldiers, and no walls. It was a tool as old as civilization itself, and it shaped one of the most remarkable defensive systems ever devised. That system was the Dutch waterline in its full glory, and its story deserves a closer look. The Dutch waterline turned a nation into a fortress of mud and silence. It was not one single wall, but a belt of low-lying land stretching from the Zuiderzee in the north to the Rhine River in the south. This strip of polders, about 50 miles long and 2 to 5 miles wide, could be deliberately flooded by opening a system of sluices and breaching dikes. The water would rise slowly, turning farmland into a shallow inland sea. It was too deep for men to wade through easily and too shallow for boats to navigate. The mud beneath the water was the real enemy. It swallowed horses, wagons, and cannons, and it turned every step into a struggle. The defenders, the Dutch, knew the hidden causeways and raised paths that remained just above the waterline. They could move troops and supplies along these secret routes while the invader floundered in the mire. The psychological effect on the enemy was profound. Imagine marching for days only to find your path blocked not by stone towers or iron gates, but by a seemingly harmless sheet of water. At first, it looks easy to cross. But the first soldier steps in and sinks to his waist. The horse refuses to move, the supply wagons bog down, and in the distance you see the roofs of Dutch villages peeking above the water, but no road leads to them. The frustration builds. The water does not fight back. It simply sits there, immovable, patient. And every hour you waste trying to find a way around, the defender grows stronger and your supplies dwindle. This system reached its defining moment during the Ramjar, the disaster year of 1672. France, under Louis XIV, invaded the Dutch Republic with an army of over 100,000 men. The Dutch were vastly outnumbered. Their regular army could not hope to stop the French in open battle, so they fell back to the waterline. They opened the sluices and broke the dikes, and the water began to creep across the land. The French advanced ground to a halt. They camped on the dry ground, staring across a shallow inland sea that stretched as far as they could see. They tried to find ways through, but every attempt ended in mud and misery. The French commander, the Prince of Condé, reportedly said that the Dutch had turned their country into a fortress whose walls were water. The waterline bought the Dutch precious months. It gave them time to negotiate alliances and to rally their own forces. Eventually, the French were forced to withdraw. The cost of the waterline was a fraction of a stone fortress. It required no massive stone quarries, no skilled masons, no decades of construction. The core investment was in the hydraulic infrastructure. Sluices, dikes, and canals already existed to manage water for agriculture. Defensive modifications were relatively cheap. The system could be maintained by local farmers and engineers, and unlike a fortress which can be besieged and starved out, the waterline could not be surrounded. It was a barrier that could be extended or shifted as needed. When the enemy left, the Dutch simply closed the sluices, drained the land, and the farms returned to normal. Over the following centuries, the waterline was modernized. In the 19th century, a ring of small forts and batteries were added at key crossing points. These forts were not standalone structures. They were integrated into the flooded landscape. Their purpose was not to stop an invasion by themselves, but to protect the sluices and the causeways that made the waterline work. The forts were low and well hidden, their ramparts barely rising above the water. They could be flooded themselves if needed, forcing an attacker to cross a moat that was part of the larger defensive sheet. The whole system was a masterpiece of integrated landscape defense. It was a fully realized example of the principle that the earth itself, reshaped by human hands, could be a more effective fortress than any stone castle. Now consider how the Romans, masters of engineering and empire, approached the problem of defending their frontiers. They built Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall in Britain, massive stone barriers. But they also relied heavily on natural features: the Rhine, the Danube, the Sahara, the mountains of the east. Their approach was a blend of hard fortifications and landscape control. The Roman frontier, called the limes, was not a single line but a zone that used rivers, forests, watchtowers, and small forts to channel and monitor movement. It was a different philosophy, but one that also understood that the land itself could fight. And as we follow that thread, we will see how the lines between stone and soil, fortress and landscape, begin to blur into something even more fascinating. The Romans called their frontier the limes, a word that meant path or boundary, but it became something far more flexible than a simple line on a map. Stretching from the Rhine in the west to the Danube in the east, this border system was a blend of natural barriers and human modifications, designed not to stop every invader but to control movement and make any crossing costly. The rivers themselves were the backbone. The Rhine and Danube were wide, fast-flowing, and difficult to cross without preparation. Rome did not build a continuous wall along these rivers. Instead, they stationed legions at key points, built watchtowers on the high ground, and maintained a network of patrol roads that ran parallel to the water. A small fortlet called a burgess would sit at a strategic bend or a ford, manned by a handful of soldiers whose job was to watch, report, and delay. Behind this front line, a cleared zone stretched for miles. Trees were cut down, undergrowth burned away, and the land kept open so that no raiding party could approach unseen. A Germanic war band trying to cross the Rhine under cover of darkness would find themselves exposed on open ground, spotted by the watchtower fires, and forced to run a gauntlet of Roman patrols long before they reached any settlement. The limes was not a wall. It was a zone of awareness and response. A raiding party might slip through occasionally, but they could not bring supplies or siege equipment. They could not stay long. The Romans did not need to defeat every invasion in open battle. They only needed to make the cost of crossing so high that most raids never even tried. For centuries, this system worked. The Germanic tribes could raid, but they could not conquer. The limes held because the rivers and the cleared land worked together, and the legions were positioned to respond quickly. But the system depended on more than geography. It depended on political stability, on a steady flow of soldiers and supplies from the heart of the empire. When that stability began to crack in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the limes weakened. Not because the rivers dried up or the watchtowers crumbled, but because the legions were pulled away to fight civil wars or defend other frontiers. The barbarians did not break through a great wall. They found gaps where the patrols had stopped, where the watchtowers stood empty, where the cleared zone had begun to grow back into forest. The limes collapsed from within, not from the force of any single attack. It was a lesson in how even the most clever landscape defense requires a human backbone to remain effective. Far to the east, another empire faced a similar challenge, but their answer was carved into the hills and valleys of an ancient land. The Great Wall of China was never just a wall. It was a living system of stone, earth, and carefully shaped wilderness that stretched across mountains, deserts, and rivers. When most people picture the Great Wall, they imagine a single unbroken line of stone snaking across the horizon. But the reality is far more intricate and far more clever. For centuries, Chinese dynasties did not rely on a single wall at all. Instead, they used the landscape itself as the primary barrier, and the wall was only one part of a much larger defensive zone. The earliest fortifications along China's northern frontier were not walls but lines of watchtowers and beacon stations connected by patrol roads. The Qin dynasty, which unified China in the 3rd century before the Common Era, built sections of rammed earth that connected existing natural barriers, steep cliffs, deep river gorges, and the edge of the Gobi Desert. These early walls were low and simple, more like a fence than a fortress. Their purpose was not to stop an army dead in its tracks. No wall could do that. Instead, they served as a guide for patrols, a way to track movement and delay raiders long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Han dynasty, which followed, took this idea further. They planted thick belts of forest along the frontier, creating a green wall that slowed cavalry and provided cover for Chinese scouts. They also dug artificial lakes and reservoirs to deny water to nomadic herders who depended on those watering holes for their horses. An invader crossing the desert would find the springs dry or the lakes turned into impassable mud. The landscape itself became a weapon of attrition. The famous sections of the Great Wall that survive today, the ones made of stone and brick and standing 10 meters high, were built much later by the Ming dynasty, more than 1,500 years after the first earth walls were raised. The Ming faced a different threat. The Mongol armies of the time were better organized and equipped with gunpowder weapons, so the Ming built taller, thicker walls with parapets and loopholes for cannons. But even then, the wall was not a solid barrier. It was a series of fortified passes, watchtowers, and garrison towns, connected by a wall that could be scaled or breached if the enemy concentrated enough force. The real defense was the network of signal towers that could relay news of an invasion across hundreds of miles in a single day, and the mobile cavalry armies stationed behind the wall that could ride to intercept any breakthrough. The wall was a tripwire and a staging platform, not a magic shield. What truly made the Chinese frontier effective was its integration with the natural terrain. To the west, the Taklamakan Desert and the towering Pamir Mountains created a barrier that required immense preparation to cross. To the north, the Gobi Desert stretched for thousands of miles, a sea of sand and gravel that swallowed armies. The Great Wall did not stand alone. It stood at the edge of these natural fortresses, and it directed any invader who managed to cross them toward a narrow strip of land where the Chinese could concentrate their defenses. The wall was the final thread in a tapestry of obstacles that began with the desert and ended with the rammed earth. This layered approach to defense, using rivers, forests, artificial lakes, and watchtowers in combination, created a frontier that could absorb raids and slow invasions without requiring a massive standing army at every point. It was flexible, adaptive, and deeply rooted in the understanding that the land itself could be taught to fight. Even the grass of the steppe, if left unburned, could hide a raiding party, so the Chinese burned it in controlled patterns to maintain clear fields of vision. Every element of the landscape was considered. And then, as the Ming dynasty faded and a new era began, the same principle of layered landscape defense would appear in a very different part of the world, along the forested borders of medieval Europe, where kings and lords carved their own frontiers out of wood and water and earth. Across the English Channel and the North Sea, a different kind of frontier took shape. In medieval Europe, the border between kingdoms was often not a line but a zone, a stretch of land deliberately kept wild and dangerous. These zones were called marches, from an old word meaning boundary, and they were crafted by neglect as much as by design. The idea was simple. Instead of building a wall, you let the land grow thick with forest, allow the bogs to spread, and leave villages abandoned so that no supplies could be gathered. An invader entering a march would find no roads, no friendly farms, no easy water. They would find only a tangled wilderness where every step was a risk. The Welsh marches offer a clear example. Along the border between England and Wales, Offa's Dyke was not a single wall but a massive earthwork combined with a zone of controlled forest. The Dyke itself was a ditch and bank that stretched for about 150 miles, but the real defense was the land on either side. The English kings deliberately kept the border region thinly populated. They did not build towns or clear fields near the Dyke. Instead, they let the forest grow dense, making it hard for Welsh raiders to cross quickly and even harder for large armies to find food or fodder. The Dyke funneled movement toward a few guarded passes, but the wilderness itself slowed every invasion. A Welsh warband that slipped across might find itself lost in unfamiliar woods, struggling to find a path while English scouts tracked their movements from hidden watchtowers. Further north, the Scottish marches were even more chaotic. Here, a stretch of land known as the Debatable Lands sat between England and Scotland for centuries. Neither kingdom fully controlled it. The area was a patchwork of bogs, thickets, and ruined farmsteads, home to border reivers who raided both sides. For an invading army, crossing the Debatable Lands was a nightmare. Supply wagons bogged down in the mire, horses could not find good grazing, and the local families knew every hidden path, every quicksand, every place where an ambush could be laid. Armies that tried to march through the Debatable Lands often lost more men to disease, accidents, and starvation than to any battle. The land itself did the fighting. Far to the east, along the frontier of the Kingdom of Hungary, a similar system emerged. The Hungarian frontier zone, called Jaipulv, was a belt of wilderness that stretched for miles along the border. The Hungarians deliberately did not settle this area. They let the forests grow, blocked the main paths, and dug ditches to redirect water and create marshes. Any invader approaching from the east or north had to cross this wild strip, and while they struggled through the brambles and mud, Hungarian light cavalry would appear from the forest edge, strike with arrows, and vanish again into the trees. This was not a war of sieges and castles. It was a war of exhaustion fought in the shadows of the woods. Light cavalry and archers were the perfect tools for these marches. They did not need to hold ground. They needed to move fast, strike hard, and disappear. The terrain gave them cover and channeled the enemy into predictable kill zones. A band of armed horsemen could ride out of a foggy valley, loose a volley of arrows into a slow-moving column, and be gone before the enemy could form a shield wall. The marches were not meant to stop an army forever. They were meant to bleed it, to break its spirit, to turn a confident invasion into a desperate retreat. This pattern appears again and again across continents. In the borderlands between the Russian principalities and the steppe nomads, vast belts of uncut forest called zayski were maintained as barriers. In the rainforests of Central America, the Maya and other civilizations left wide strips of jungle between their city-states, creating natural no-man's lands that slowed enemy forces and made surprise attacks nearly impossible. The logic is universal. When you cannot afford a fortress or when a static wall is too easy to bypass, you let the land itself become the guardian. You do not build a wall. You grow a forest, you dig a ditch, you let the marsh spread, and you wait, because the invader who faces a march does not face a single obstacle. They face 1,000 small deaths, all of them hidden in the shape of the earth. Across the Atlantic, the same logic took root in entirely different soils. The civilizations of the Americas built their own defensive landscapes, using rivers, mountains, and earth in ways that mirrored the old world strategies, but with unique innovations born from their environments. In the heart of the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan stood as a masterwork of landscape defense. It was built on an island in the middle of a shallow lake, connected to the mainland by 3 narrow causeways. These causeways were not simply roads. They were carefully engineered choke points, each only wide enough for a few men to walk abreast. Canals crisscrossed the city itself, turning its streets into waterways that only local boats could navigate. An invading army approaching Tenochtitlan would first have to cross the lake, a difficult feat requiring hundreds of boats or a long march around the shore. If they managed to reach the causeways, they would find themselves funneled into a narrow corridor, exposed on both sides to Aztec warriors in canoes who could shoot arrows or throw spears from the water. The causeways also had removable bridges at strategic points. The Aztecs could lift these bridges behind them as they retreated, turning the causeway into a gauntlet with no escape. The city itself became a trap, not a fortress. It was a place where the landscape, the water, and the narrow paths worked together to break any attack into manageable pieces. The Spanish conquistadors under Hernán Cortés learned this lesson the hard way during the Noche Triste, the sad night, when their retreat across a causeway turned into a slaughter. The water and the narrow stone path had become allies of the Aztec defenders. Further south, in the Andes, the Inca Empire took a different approach. They had no lakes to build on, but they had something arguably more formidable: the mountains themselves. Inca fortresses were not isolated walls, but integrated into the steep, rocky terrain. Machu Picchu, perhaps the most famous Inca site, was built on a ridge between 2 peaks, with cliffs dropping hundreds of feet on 3 sides. The only approach was along a narrow trail that wound up the mountain, passing through several gateways, each one defensible by a small group of guards. An invader climbing that trail would be exposed, exhausted by the altitude, and vulnerable to rocks or arrows from above. The Inca also built long terraces on the mountain slopes. These terraces were primarily for farming, but they also served a military purpose. They broke up the landscape into horizontal steps that made it difficult to move quickly. A charging force would have to climb each terrace wall, slowing them down and forcing them into predictable patterns where Inca slingers and archers could pick them off. At Sacsayhuaman, overlooking the Inca capital of Cusco, the walls were not straight lines but zigzags, designed to expose attackers to fire from multiple angles as they approached. The stones were so precisely fitted that a blade of grass could not slide between them, and the sheer height of the walls, combined with the steep hillside, made them nearly impossible to scale. These were not fortresses in the European sense. They were the mountain itself, shaped and enhanced by human hands. Far to the north, in the Mississippi River Valley, another civilization built its own kind of defensive landscape. The Mississippian culture, centered around cities like Cahokia, constructed massive earthen mounds that rose from the flat floodplains. These mounds were not just ceremonial platforms. Many were surrounded by palisades, walls of upright logs that could be defended from the top. The mounds themselves provided a commanding view of the surrounding land. An enemy approaching a Mississippian town would have to cross open fields, cross rivers or streams, and then face a log wall that could be fortified by hundreds of defenders. The terrain was deliberately kept clear of trees for a wide radius, so no attacker could approach unseen. The combination of mounds, palisades, and cleared land created a layered defense that channeled any assault into predictable kill zones. The mounds also served as elevated platforms for archers, giving them a clear shot at anyone trying to breach the wall. These were not static monuments. They were living components of a defensive system designed to protect communities in a landscape of constant competition. Across these three very different cultures, one principle held true. The land was never left as it was found. It was shaped, controlled, and turned into a weapon that worked alongside human effort. The causeways of Tenochtitlan, the mountain fortresses of the Inca, the mounds and palisades of the Mississippians all shared a common goal: to slow down invaders, to force them into narrow, exposed positions, and to make every step cost something. The defender knew the ground, the invader did not, and that difference, as old as war itself, created a psychological weight that went far beyond the physical obstacles. The fear of the unknown ground was often more powerful than the ground itself. An invader marching through an unfamiliar forest or across a flooded plain did not just face mud and thorns. They faced the growing weight of doubt. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be an ambush. Every bend in the trail could lead to a dead end or a trap. The mind, left to imagine the worst, often became a more effective enemy than any hidden spear. This psychological erosion began long before the first arrow was shot. The delay itself was a weapon. An army that expected to cover 20 miles in a day might manage only 5, struggling through marshland or hacking through dense brush. The schedule slipped, food and fodder ran low, soldiers grew tired and resentful. Water supplies, already uncertain, became contaminated by the muddy ground. And all the while, the defender was watching, waiting, and feeding those fears with small, sudden strikes. One Roman commander, campaigning in the dark forests of Germania, wrote with bitter frustration that the trees seemed to conspire against him. The ground was never solid, the paths twisted and vanished. The locals fought for a few minutes and then melted away, leaving only silence and the creak of branches. His legions, already exhausted by the march, began to hear imaginary war cries in the wind. Morale cracked, the campaign stalled. The forest had won without ever giving a proper battle. This pattern repeated across centuries and continents. A Mongol general, leading his horsemen into the jungles of Vietnam, found that the trees stole his cavalry's speed and his archers' vision. The Vietnamese defenders did not need to stand and fight. They only needed to remind the Mongols day after day that they were not welcome. The fear of the next poisoned bamboo stake, the next mud pit that could swallow a horse, the next unseen archer in the canopy, it wore down an army's confidence faster than any siege. The defender, meanwhile, grew bolder. Every day that the invader remained stuck in the mire was a small victory. Local knowledge became a source of power. The defender knew which streams were safe to cross and which led to quicksand. They knew where the ground firmed up in the dry season and where the mosquitoes grew thickest in the wet. They could move along hidden paths, sleep in dry camps, and eat from hidden stores while the enemy shivered in the damp. This asymmetry created a profound shift in morale. The defender felt like a master of their world, a clever fox in their own den, while the invader stumbled like a blind giant. Symbolically, these defensive landscapes also carried a message. When a kingdom built a line of earthworks or maintained a deliberate wilderness along its border, it announced that it was willing to reshape the land itself to protect its people. This was not a passive acceptance of geography. It was a statement of resolve. The Dutch waterline, the Danevirke, the great forest belts of northern Europe, they told any would-be conqueror that this land would not yield easily. The struggle would be long, costly, and humiliating. The psychological impact often exceeded the physical obstacle. An army that had heard stories of impassable forests or bottomless marshes approached with dread. Their caution slowed them further, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. They moved so carefully that they exhausted themselves before ever reaching the defenders' heartland. Some generals simply turned back, convinced that no victory could justify the misery ahead. But for all its strength, this method of war had cracks. It required patience and discipline from the defender, and it could not stop a determined enemy forever. But even the most carefully shaped landscape had its moments of weakness. A swamp that stopped an army in summer could become a highway in winter when the water froze solid. A forest that hid defenders in spring might be burned to the ground in autumn. Defensive landscapes, for all their cleverness, were static. They could not move to meet a threat, and they depended on conditions that were never guaranteed. The Dutch found this out in the brutal winter of 1794 to 1795. The French Revolutionary Army, facing the Dutch waterline, did not try to force the mud. Instead, they waited. The temperature dropped. The shallow floodwaters that had blocked them for months turned to ice. French cavalry crossed the frozen fields at a trot, their horses' hooves ringing on the hard surface. The water, which had been the defender's greatest weapon, became a flat, open road for the invader. The Dutch sluices and dikes could not stop a freeze. The landscape had betrayed them. This was not the only weakness. Droughts could drain swamps, turning impassable wetlands into dusty, cracked ground that an army could cross with ease. In East Africa, seasonal rains dictated when the great marshes could serve as a barrier. A dry year meant a wide, open frontier, and in heavily forested regions, invaders sometimes simply burned the trees. The smoke might choke them, but the cleared ground allowed cavalry to move and archers to see. Local guides were another vulnerability. No matter how secret the hidden paths, there was always someone who knew them. A captured farmer, a bribed elder, or a disgruntled local could reveal the safe routes through a flooded plain or the firm ground beneath a seasonal marsh. The defenders' advantage depended on their monopoly of knowledge, and that monopoly could be broken by a single act of betrayal or a single prisoner who talked. Armies also developed tools to overcome the obstacles. In marshy terrain, Roman engineers built corduroy roads, laying logs side by side across the mud to create a stable track for soldiers and supplies. Medieval armies carried fascines, bundles of brushwood that could be thrown into a ditch to create a quick crossing. And when faced with a steep earthwork or a high bank, attackers could bring siege towers on wheels or simply dig a ramp up the slope. The defenders' shaping of the land was met by the invaders' reshaping of their own path. Each innovation in defensive landscape was answered by a counter-innovation. Over centuries, the balance shifted. The rise of gunpowder artillery made earthen ramparts less effective, because a cannon could smash a bank of earth just as easily as a stone wall. The development of military engineering corps meant that armies could cut roads through forests, bridge rivers, and drain swamps in a matter of weeks, not months. The slow, patient war of attrition that the defensive landscape depended on began to lose its power. And as the world moved into an era of industrialization and total war, the old idea of letting the land fight for you was replaced by something faster, more brutal, and less patient. But before that decline, the concept had one last great flowering in the trenches and shell craters of the 20th century, where the landscape was turned into a weapon of stagnant horror. And that strange echo of the ancient method holds a final lesson for anyone who thinks that the ground beneath their feet is merely passive. Gunpowder changed everything about how armies approached the land. A cannon could smash through an earthen bank in hours, work that would have taken days of digging with hand tools. The slow, patient obstacles that had once slowed entire invasions were now simply blown apart. Defensive landscapes, which relied on making movement costly and time-consuming, suddenly faced an enemy who could remove those obstacles at will. Armies also grew larger and more mobile. The engineering corps of the 18th and 19th centuries became a standard part of any military force. They carried tools to build roads across marshes, to lay pontoon bridges over rivers in a matter of hours, and to clear forests with organized axes and saws. The ancient advantage of local knowledge began to fade. A modern army could map a region, cut a path through a thicket, and drag cannons into position faster than any medieval force could have dreamed. For a while, it seemed that defensive landscapes were a relic of a more primitive era, but the idea never fully died. It simply transformed. When the armies of World War I faced a stalemate across the fields of France and Belgium, they turned back to the land. They dug trenches, of course, but they also created artificial obstacles that echoed the ancient strategies. Flooded zones were deliberately created by opening sluices along the Usse River in Belgium, turning miles of farmland into shallow, muddy water that no soldier could cross. The French and German armies also used abatis, felled trees with sharpened branches, to block routes through forests and narrow valleys. The old tools of ditches, earth banks, and obstacles were reborn in the form of barbed wire, concrete pillboxes, and flooded craters. The landscape itself, churned by shellfire and reshaped by spades, became a weapon of attrition once again. The defender did not need to win a battle. They only needed to make the enemy bleed for every yard. This new form of landscape defense reached its most ambitious expression in the Maginot Line, built by France after the First World War. The Maginot Line is often remembered as a chain of massive concrete fortresses, but it was far more than that. It was a hybrid system that blended hard fortifications with the natural terrain. The line followed the high ground, used rivers as moats, and incorporated forests and rugged hills into its design. In some sections, engineers flooded low-lying areas to create water obstacles. They planted dense tree lines to break up formations. The forts themselves were sunk into the earth, their guns emerging from armored cupolas that were nearly invisible from the ground. The entire system was a marriage of stone and soil, a final echo of the ancient wisdom that the land itself could fight. And though the Maginot Line was famously bypassed in 1940, its principles did not vanish. They simply evolved into the defensive doctrines of the Cold War, where terrain was used to channel tank advances, and where forests, rivers, and mountains were treated as natural barriers that could be reinforced with mines and obstacles. The lesson of the defensive landscape still holds. In the modern era, when satellites can map every inch of ground and drones can watch from above, the land itself remains a slow, stubborn force that no amount of technology can fully erase. A forest still slows a convoy, a flooded field still stops a truck, and the psychological weight of moving through unknown ground, uncertain what lies ahead, still wears down an army as surely as it did a Roman legion. The ancient strategy of shaping the land to fight for you has never truly disappeared. It only changes its tools. Those tools took on new forms in the 20th century, when the old principles of delaying and exhausting an invader were adapted to the age of machines and gunpowder. The basic logic never changed. You still wanted to slow the enemy, force them into predictable paths, and make every mile cost something. Only the materials evolved. Minefields, for example, became the modern equivalent of hidden pits and caltrops. A field of buried explosives did not need to destroy every vehicle that entered. Its real power was the fear it created. An army approaching a minefield had to stop, send out engineers to clear a path, and advance at a crawl. The delay was often more damaging than the mines themselves. The same thinking drove the use of abatis in tank warfare. Armies would fell trees across a road or through a forest, laying the trunks with branches sharpened to points. A tank could not simply roll over such an obstacle. It had to stop, back up, and try to find a way around while anti-tank guns and infantry waited in ambush. The abatis was as old as Rome, but it worked just as well against armor as it had against cavalry. Flooding also returned, and on a massive scale. During the Second World War, both sides used water as a weapon. The German army, when retreating from the Netherlands in 1944, deliberately flooded large areas of Dutch farmland by opening dikes and sluices. The water turned fields into shallow lakes, just as the Dutch water line had done centuries earlier, only now the flood was designed to slow Allied armor and supply columns. The result was a landscape of mud and isolation. Villages became islands, roads vanished beneath the water. The Allies had to use amphibious vehicles or build temporary bridges to advance, and every mile cost precious time. The Germans understood that they could not hold the ground forever, but they could make the Allies pay for it. Across the Korean peninsula, a different kind of no-go zone was created. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, established after the armistice in 1953, is a strip of land 2.5 miles wide that runs for 155 miles. It is not a wall of concrete, but a landscape deliberately left wild. The forests have grown thick, the rivers have been allowed to spread into marshes. The ground is crisscrossed with fences and minefields, but the real barrier is the terrain itself. The zone has become an accidental nature preserve, but its original purpose was purely tactical. Any large-scale invasion would have to cross this belt of dense vegetation, flooded areas, and open ground exposed to observation. The land would slow the attacker, channel their columns, and give the defender time to react. It is a defensive landscape in the oldest sense, shaped by human hands to work against an enemy. Even the urban landscape has been turned into an obstacle. When a city is ruined by war, the rubble itself becomes a kind of terrain. Collapsed buildings create mazes of narrow passages. Streets are blocked by fallen masonry. Basements become pits that can swallow vehicles. Soldiers learn to treat a ruined city as a landscape of deliberate obstacles, where every corner hides a threat and movement is slow and dangerous. Defenders have often destroyed their own cities to create this effect, turning stone and steel into a new kind of earthwork. In all these cases, the principle remains the same. The land is not a neutral stage for battle. It is an active participant. The defender reshapes it, floods it, mines it, or leaves it wild, all to force the invader into a slow, costly, uncertain advance. Technology has given us tanks, aircraft, and satellites, but no machine can make mud dry or make a forest disappear instantly. The ground still resists. And that resistance, that stubborn, patient refusal to be crossed quickly, is the enduring wisdom behind landscape defense. It is a reminder that no matter how powerful an army seems, the earth beneath its feet can be a more stubborn enemy than any human foe. The ancient builders who dug their ditches and planted their forests understood something that still holds true today. The best fortress is the one that never has to be built. This ancient strategy has never truly left us. It simply hides in plain sight, waiting for the careful observer to notice. The defensive landscapes we have explored, from the flooded fields of the Dutch Republic to the forested marches of medieval Europe, from the mountain passes of the Inca to the river lines of Rome, share a common thread. They were elegant, cost-effective, and deeply intelligent responses to the problem of invasion. They did not require decades of stone cutting or the wealth of an empire. They required knowledge of the land, a willingness to work with nature instead of against it, and the patience to let time and terrain do the fighting. In many ways, these strategies were more sophisticated than any fortress. A stone wall can be stormed, bypassed, or starved, but a swamp that shifts with the seasons, a forest that hides 1,000 ambushes, a river that can be redirected in a single night, these are living defenses that adapt and endure. Yet popular military history often overlooks them. We remember names like the Great Wall, Hadrian's Wall, and the Maginot Line. We imagine towering ramparts and heroic last stands. But the slow, quiet work of shaping the land, of digging ditches and planting hedges and opening sluices, rarely captures the public imagination. Why is that? Perhaps it is because these defenses are harder to see. They blend into the landscape. A tourist visiting the Dutch countryside does not immediately recognize the low dikes and hidden sluices as weapons of war. A hiker crossing Offa's Dyke might see only a grassy ridge, not the centuries of strategy that shaped it. The invisibility of these defenses is part of their brilliance, but it also makes them easy to forget. We tend to celebrate the dramatic, the visible, the stories of heroes and sieges. The quiet genius of the landscape itself, the farmer who dug a ditch that saved a kingdom, the engineer who knew exactly when to open a sluice gate, these stories are harder to tell. But they are no less important. They remind us that the land is not a passive backdrop to history. It is an active participant. The hills and rivers and forests have shaped human decisions for millennia, and we ignore that at our own peril. So the next time you stand on a hillside or walk through a forest, take a moment to wonder, could this ground have been a weapon? Did someone, centuries ago, look at this same slope and see not a scenic view but a place to stop an army? The landscape holds secrets that are waiting to be noticed, and that is the enduring mystery of defensive landscapes. They were not built to be remembered. They were built to be effective, and in their silence they have taught us something profound about human creativity and the endless ingenuity of those who refused to build a wall. What other examples have you spotted in your own travels or reading? Have you walked across an ancient earthwork or seen a floodplain that seemed too perfect to be natural? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to continue uncovering the hidden strategies that shaped history, subscribe and join us for the next exploration. The ground beneath your feet has more to say than you might think.